Welcome to the deep dive. If we had to define 2025 in just one sentence, I think it would be this. It was the year the climate crisis stopped being a future problem and just smashed headlong into our present reality.
It really did. We're talking about this collision of, on the one hand, the accelerating physical world.
Wildfires that didn't just break records, they, vaporize them.
Exactly, and these inland ghost storms creating unbelievable flooding. And then on the other hand, you have this frustrating, slow, complicated world of global policy and finance trying to catch up.
And that's the tension, right? You have COP30, a huge international summit, finally officially acknowledging that we're probably going to overshoot the 1.5 degrees Celsius target.
Right. It's this profound crisis hitting the balance sheets, hitting people's homes, while the global response is, still trying to lay the foundation. It's like building the fire station while the city's already burning.
That's the core painful tension we are here to unpack for you today.
We're really looking at two parallel realities. The first is that visceral physical crisis we just mentioned, record warmth, devastating catastrophes. Our source material just lays it out in brutal detail.
And the second reality?
It's the architecture of the global response. And it's slow, it's complex, and frankly, it is heavily underfunded. We're seeing these huge climate finance shortfalls right next to these really contentious policy negotiations.
So our mission today is to cut through that mountain of data for you and pull out what you really need to know.
Yeah, we've synthesized a huge stack of essential reports, from the hard numbers from reinsurers like Swiss Re to the climate science from the WMO and NASA, disaster trackers.
And then the big policy and finance bodies, the European Central Bank, LSEG, and of course the final outcomes from COP30 in Belém, Brazil.
We're going to give you that shortcut to being fully informed on where the planet and its economic systems really stand at the close of this pivotal year.
Okay, let's start where the risk is most immediate, where you can really count it. Let's start with the balance sheet. If you really want to understand just how fast these disasters are accelerating, you have to follow the money.
You really do. And specifically, you have to follow the reinsurance money.
Right. Because they're the ones insuring the insurance companies. They see everything.
They see everything. And when the Swiss Re Institute published its final estimates for 2025, the headline figure was depressingly familiar. But what's underneath that number? It reveals this terrifying concentration of risk that should be setting off alarm bells everywhere.
Okay, so give us the big number first.
For the sixth year in a row, insured natural catastrophe losses went over the $100 billion threshold. The final estimate for 2025 landed at $107 billion US.
$107 billion. Now, I know that's actually a drop from 2024, which was a massive year at $141 billion.
It is a drop, but that's almost misleading. The crucial point here, the thing analysts are focused on, is that the long-term trend, the 10-year average, is still on a steep upward climb.
So 1 year doesn't change the pattern.
Not at all. It shows a persistent, accelerating risk that is fundamentally changing how we price catastrophe exposure around the world.
But you said the real story was the concentration, so that $107 billion, it wasn't spread evenly around the globe.
Not even close. And this is what's so fascinating and, deeply concerning for anyone trying to model risk. Of that $107 billion global total, a staggering 83% of it,
83.
which is about $89 billion, came from the United States alone.
Wow. Okay, so why? Why is so much of the financial pain concentrated right there?
It really boils down to two main things. First, you just have a much higher rate of private insurance in the U.S. for certain types of events. Think thunderstorms, hail, what we call secondary perils.
Right.
In other parts of the world, that might be covered by a government fund or, honestly, might just not be insured at all. So the U.S. numbers pop more. The second factor, though, is development. We are seeing this massive increase in building homes, infrastructure in known risk areas.
Building in harm's way.
Exactly. Along coastlines, in the wildland-urban interface in California, you have very high-value assets moving directly into the danger zone. So when a disaster hits, the economic fallout is just immense.
The U.S. is kind of the canary in the coal mine for the private insurance market then.
A very expensive canary. And you have to remember, the reinsurers themselves, they aren't just, bean counters who write checks. They can't be.
What's their other role?
Swiss Re's analysis makes it really clear. They have this dual role. Yes, they are the financial shock absorbers, but they also have to support, and sometimes they have to actively drive, the development of more resilient public policy and private investment.
So they're pushing for things like better building codes.
Better building codes, zoning restrictions, better flood defenses. because they can only absorb these shocks for so long. Eventually, they have to become policy partners, or else the premiums just become unaffordable, or they just stop offering coverage altogether in some areas.
And to really understand the scale of what happened in 2025, we have to go beyond that big number and look at a couple of specific events. Let's start with the fire season that just exploded in California in January.
We have to talk about the Southern California wildfires, specifically the Palisades and Eaton fires. This was something else. It was the combination of the severity, the timing. It was in January when fire risk is usually lower, and the location.
And it was driven by what? The Santa Ana winds?
Unbelievably fierce Santa Ana winds, coupled with exceptional dryness. The result was just catastrophic.
How catastrophic are we talking in dollar terms?
These fires led to the highest insured wildfire losses ever recorded, a phenomenal $40 billion US.
$40 billion from one fire event.
From one fire event. That makes it the costliest wildfire globally, period. It rewrote the books. And it was the single most destructive fire in the history of the city of Los Angeles.
It's hard to even process a number like $40 billion for a wildfire. But the total damage, the full economic impact, that went way beyond just the insured part, right?
Oh, absolutely. The insured loss covers, the cost to rebuild. But the total economic impact ripples out. It hits infrastructure, supply chains, public health, tourism, everything. The total economic hit was estimated at a staggering $112 billion.
$112 billion.
And just think about the physical destruction. Over 16,000 structures were just gone. Homes, public buildings, businesses.
That $112 billion number, it needs some context because that's a really critical psychological and economic marker.
It absolutely is. To put that in historical perspective for you, that $112 billion total economic loss surpasses the unadjusted economic estimate for Hurricane Katrina.
It's bigger than Katrina.
Bigger than Katrina's initial estimate. We are talking about the kind of financial devastation we usually associate with a Category 5 hurricane hitting a major city, but this was a wildfire.
And that's not even counting the cost of fighting it.
Right. The suppression and response costs alone were $6 billion. And then there's the heartbreaking human cost, the fires and the intense smoke that blanketed the region. They claimed approximately 482 lives.
Both from the fire itself and from, the smoke making health conditions worse.
Exactly. Exacerbating respiratory and cardiovascular disease. It's a brutal number.
That comparison, Katrina versus the LA fires, it really shows that these so-called secondary perils like wildfires and floods, they aren't secondary at all anymore.
They're primary drivers of catastrophe. And it shows that our old risk models just completely failed to grasp the risk of building in that urban wildland interface, especially under these new climate conditions.
Okay, let's pivot now from fire on the coast to water in the heartland. This gives us our second major case study, the rapid inland flooding that hit the central Texas Hill Country in July.
This event was a terrifying demonstration of something we're seeing more and more of. It wasn't a hurricane from the coast. It was a rapid onset inland catastrophe. And it was caused by something called a mesoscale convective vortex, an MCV.
Right. The media dubbed these ghost storms, which suggests they're hard to see coming. What are they exactly?
So an MCV is basically a little low pressure center, a little spin that forms inside a much bigger complex of thunderstorms. The key thing is they're relatively small, maybe 30 to 60 miles wide, so they can get overlooked by standard weather models that are looking for big frontal systems.
And why ghost storm?
Because they can hang around for hours after the main storm system has died out. They just persist. And then all of a sudden, they can rapidly reignite into these incredibly violent stationary thunderstorms that are just locked in one place that catch everyone completely off guard.
And in Texas, that intensity meant a catastrophic amount of water in a very short time.
It really did. This MCV just stalled over the hill country and dumped over 20 inches of rain in less than 6 hours. The result was this unbelievable inland flash flood.
And the speed of the water rising was what really set the record here.
That was the terrifying part. The Guadalupe River set a new flash flood record. The rate of rise was measured at 26 feet in just 45 minutes.
26 feet in 45 minutes, that's a wall of water.
It's an inland tsunami. It surged to over 31 feet total in under 90 minutes. It's almost impossible to survive that if you're caught in it.
And it became the deadliest U.S. inland flooding event in decades.
In nearly 50 years. And the tragic lesson here, which the sources really highlight, is that these events are happening further inland in places where the infrastructure, the bridges, the culverts, and the emergency services are just not prepared for it. Their whole system is based on historical rainfall data that is now totally obsolete.
And on top of these two massive headline-grabbing events, you still have the constant grinding pressure of severe convective storms.
Absolutely. SCS events, that's your thunderstorms, hail, tornadoes, straight-line winds, they drove $50 billion of global insured losses in 2025.
50 billion.
That's the third highest figure on record for SCS. So it just cements their role as this major, persistent loss driver. They're not a one-off, they are systemic.
So you add up the fires, the inland floods, the constant drumbeat of storms.
And it's clear. The first half of 2025 was the single costliest 6 months in U.S. history for natural disaster events. We are just in a completely new era of catastrophe finance.
So let's zoom out from the balance sheet now to the bigger picture, the global physical indicators that are driving all this chaos. We need to talk about temperature and ice.
The data from the WMO and the NSIDC, it just confirms that these financial losses are symptoms of a much deeper systemic crisis. The period from 2015 to 2025 is now set to be the warmest decade on record.
A whole decade.
A whole decade of record warmth. And for the first part of 2025, from January through August, the global mean temperature was already at 1.42 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels.
1.42. That is right on the doorstep of the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement limit.
It really underscores the acceleration. We're not seeing a slow, steady climb anymore. We're seeing an intensification. We are now operating in a 1.4-degree world, and the impacts we're seeing, the fires, the floods, are what you get at this level of warming.
And the polar regions are basically screaming confirmation of this trend.
In the most dramatic way possible, the Arctic sea ice maximum after the winter freeze was the lowest ever recorded.
And that's so critical because of the feedback loop, right?
The albedo effect, exactly. Less white ice means more dark ocean, which absorbs more heat, which leads to even warmer temperatures and even less ice the next year. It's a dangerous cycle. Meanwhile, down south, Antarctic sea ice was tracking well below average all year long.
All of this physical reality is forcing a really harsh reassessment of risk, and not just in the developing world, but in high-income countries, too.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the long-term climate risk index, which looks back from 1993 to 2022, you see countries in the global south with the deepest scars. Dominica is number one because Hurricane Maria caused damage equal to 270% of its GDP.
Just wiped out the economy.
Completely. But the more recent data from 22 shows this really troubling convergence.
What's the shift?
The shift is that 7 of the 10 most affected countries in that year were high-income nations. We're talking Italy, Spain, the U.S., the U.K. This is a crucial finding because it just shatters that old assumption that this is primarily a problem for the developing world.
So even though the global north has more capacity to cope, they are getting hit directly and severely.
And it's forcing them to rapidly increase their own climate risk management. The chaos in the U.S. insurance market is proof of that.
And we can't forget the deadliest hazard of all, which often doesn't make the same financial headlines.
Heat. By far, heat waves were the deadliest extreme weather event in 2022, causing over 61,000 fatalities.
And heat is often an indirect killer.
It is. It exacerbates existing health conditions, it strains power grids, it destroys harvests. And the situation is particularly urgent in Europe, which the data shows is the fastest warming continent on the planet. It's heating up at twice the global average.
Which is turning what used to be a rare threat into a lethal new normal. Now, before we move on, I just have to mention something subtle but really important that came up in the source material about the data itself.
Right. There's this paradox of having an overwhelming amount of data, but also seeing new information gaps starting to appear.
Yes. As of November 2025, NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, NCEI, they announced they're going to stop updating their billion-dollar weather and climate disasters product.
Which has been the benchmark for decades, right?
It's been the authoritative benchmark for U.S. catastrophe costs, so to stop updating it is a really significant decision.
What do you think that signals? Is it that the scale of the financial damage is now so continuous and widespread that one centralized system just can't keep up anymore?
It could be. It raises a really important question about whether we're even effectively tracking the true cost if major government bodies are stepping back from these key benchmarks. It's this moment where data overload is somehow creating an information gap. That discussion of the immense, almost untrackable financial cost leads us right into the foundational crisis that underpins all of it. The collapse of our natural systems.
Yeah, we have to shift from the immediate quantifiable cost of disaster to the foundational long-term cost of biodiversity loss.
And this isn't just an environmental issue, right? This is a fundamental stability issue for all of human society.
It really is. I mean, we can skip the textbook definition of biodiversity.
Right.
What you need to know is that it's the heartbeat of our planet. It's the engine that gives us everything we need to live: food, medicine, clean air, clean water, a stable climate. Our entire civilization is built on the complexity of nature.
And yet, that very foundation is being just aggressively eroded. The scale of the loss that the sources cite is truly alarming.
It is. One major synthesis of research found that, on average, the number of species at sites impacted by humans was almost 20% lower than at pristine sites.
20%. And this isn't just about, tigers and pandas and far-off lands.
No, this is a systematic, measurable collapse of complexity happening everywhere, in ecosystems all over the globe.
So if climate change is the accelerator for the physical risks we just talked about, what's the primary engine driving this biological collapse?
According to the research, the number one driver remains our food systems and agricultural expansion. It is the largest factor in land use change globally. When you convert a forest to, say, an industrial farm or a cattle ranch, that loss of biological complexity is immediate and it's immense.
And then the other drivers follow on from that.
Right. Overexploitation, pollution. And then, of course, climate change itself is rapidly becoming a major driver of biodiversity loss, too. It's this destructive synergy.
Which is pushing us towards these ecological tipping points.
Exactly. And we need to be really clear about what a tipping point is. It sounds a bit academic, but the consequences are very, very real.
So break it down for us.
A tipping point is when the damage to a system hits a critical threshold and the change that follows becomes self-perpetuating, it's abrupt, and it's potentially irreversible. Think of it like a domino effect in nature.
So, for example, the Amazon rainforest.
The Amazon is the classic example. If you lose enough of the rainforest to deforestation and drought, you could flip the entire system from being a carbon sink that absorbs CO2 to a carbon source that emits it. That would lead to irreversible regional drying. It's not just that we're losing species one by one. We are risking systemic failure of the entire ecosystem.
Let's connect that loss of complexity directly to something that everyone cares about: their health. What is the value of a standing tropical forest beyond just being a giant carbon store?
Well, from a climate perspective alone, they're fundamental. Tropical forests store 15 to 20 years' worth of our global carbon emissions. They represent about 30% of the planet's carbon storage. Protecting them is absolutely non-negotiable for climate mitigation.
But the critical link that the source material really hammers home is the one between habitat destruction and our own health security.
This is a devastating connection. It just gets overlooked in policy debates that are all about emissions. The data is just sobering. 60% of emerging infectious diseases originate in wildlife.
60%.
And nearly a third of all disease outbreaks are linked directly to habitat destruction.
How does that actually work? Why does cutting down a forest invite a pandemic?
Well, when you destroy an ecosystem, you displace wildlife. Bats, rodents, primates. They're forced into closer and closer contact with human settlements and livestock. That breakdown of the natural barrier dramatically increases the chance of what's called zoonotic spillover.
Where a pathogen jumps from an animal to a human.
Exactly. The more you fragment the habitat, the more you stress these animal populations, the greater the chances that a dangerous new pathogen will emerge.
And we have concrete, terrifying examples of this actually happening.
We do. Think about the 1997 forest fires in Indonesia. The smoke and destruction drove fruit bats carrying the deadly Nipah virus into populated areas. That outbreak led to 105 deaths.
And there's a more recent example with Ebola.
Yes, in 2013, the very first case, the index case for that catastrophic Ebola outbreak in West Africa, was a young boy. He was playing near a tree that was infested with bats that had been displaced by recent deforestation. That single spillover event led to an outbreak that killed 11,000 people.
These aren't just freak accidents, they are direct consequences of how we're treating the planet.
They are demonstrated consequences of ecosystem degradation.
And it gets worse, because when we destroy these ecosystems, we are also destroying the potential cures for future diseases. The sources note that roughly a quarter of all modern medicines come from rainforest plants.
25%. And yet, we've examined less than 1% of tropical species for their pharmaceutical properties.
So we're basically burning the world's greatest biological library before we've even had a chance to read the books.
That is the tragedy of it. We are trading long-term health and planetary stability for very short-term agricultural gain.
This brings us to the promise, but also the very serious limits of what are called nature-based solutions, or NBS.
Right. The idea is that things like limiting deforestation, restoring ecosystems, improving how we farm, they have the potential to deliver about 30% of the global emissions reductions we need by 2030 or 2050.
That potential is huge, but the implementation, that's where it gets tricky. The sources detail a lot of cautionary tales.
They do. You have to be so careful that when you're focusing on removing carbon, you don't accidentally make the biodiversity crisis even worse.
What's an example of that?
A classic case is having a short-sighted focus on just CO2. There were subsidies for planting trees afforestation in Chile for a number of years, but it turned out that these subsidies actually likely decreased biodiversity
Oh.
because they incentivized planting huge areas of fast-growing non-native trees, monocultures. They were replacing complex native ecosystems with these simple tree farms and calling it a nature-based solution,
And then there's a whole greenwashing concern.
which undermines the entire effort. The danger is that big polluters use these NBS credits to just offset their emissions instead of actually making deep cuts in their own operations. It allows them to claim they're making progress while they just continue with business as usual.
So it's clear. The physical crisis and the financial shock we talked about earlier, they are deeply rooted in this foundational crisis of nature loss.
A failure to protect nature is a failure to protect the stability of our own civilization. It's that simple.
So if the first half of 2025 was all about the raw physical power of the crisis, the end of the year was defined by the political struggle to actually do something about it.
All right, we now move into the global governance structures that are attempting and often, failing to translate this scientific urgency into global action.
Let's dive into COP30, which took place in Belém, Brazil in November.
The big theme for COP30 was the global mutuaround, which means collective efforts. The expectation going in was really high. This was supposed to be the COP of implementation.
But the outcomes, they showed a huge gap between ambition and reality.
A deep and concerning gap, especially around the core targets of the Paris Agreement.
And the final text made a massive political statement about that 1.5 degrees Celsius target.
It did. The text said we should still aim to keep the 1.5 limit within reach, but for the first time in a major COP decision, it acknowledged the likelihood of a 1.5-degree overshoot.
An overshoot, that's a profound shift in the language, isn't it?
It's a huge shift. It is a de facto admission that the world is behind schedule and will likely temporarily breach that Paris target. The text even noted that the remaining carbon budget is, quote, small and being rapidly depleted.
What does that admission of an overshoot really mean for policymakers? Does it shift the job from prevention to recovery?
It creates this really dangerous dual mandate.
Mm.
On one hand, you have to massively increase spending on adaptation to prepare for the much hotter world that is now coming. But on the other hand, you also have to aggressively ramp up mitigation, including carbon removal, to try and pull temperatures back down later.
The danger, I guess, is that it gives a kind of political permission slip for failing in the short term.
It weakens the pressure for immediate cuts. That's the risk.
And the actual emissions commitments from countries confirmed this gap.
They really did. At the end of COP30, 122 countries had submitted their new national plans, their NDCs. That represents about 74% of global emissions. But the UN analysis showed that all those plans combined deliver less than 15% of the cuts we need by 2035.
So where does that leave us?
It leaves the world on track for 2.3 to 2.8 degrees Celsius of warming. It's a chasm between the rhetoric and the reality of the commitments.
And the political divides were fierce, especially around the core issue, fossil fuels.
We saw some intense diplomatic fights. Over 80 countries were pushing for a clear, formal roadmap to guide the transition away from fossil fuels.
But that push failed. It wasn't in the final text.
It failed. It was blocked by opposition from a small but very powerful coalition of countries, specifically the major petrostates that rely on those revenues.
What was their argument? How did they manage to block something with so much support?
Their leverage was really about economics and timing. They argued that forcing a transition away from fossil fuels without guaranteed massive financial support for energy security in developing nations was basically punitive and hypocritical.
So they created a political firewall?
A very powerful one.
Mm-hmm.
The compromise was minimal. Brazil announced it would develop its own roadmaps on fossil fuels and deforestation, but that global, universally agreed path, it's still missing.
What's also really disturbing is the opposition we saw directed at the climate science itself.
This is a very worrying trend. We saw what were described as concerted efforts by a very small group of countries to weaken any references to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as the provider of the best available science.
So they're trying to undermine the scientific foundation of the entire process.
Exactly. It adds friction to an already incredibly difficult process. When you try to elevate, unverified analysis to the same level as the IPCC's work, it just serves to delay action and dilute the scientific consensus in the final policy.
This whole political struggle was maybe most visible in the launch of one of the year's most ambitious but also most controversial financing ideas, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, or TFFF.
The TFFF is a direct structural response to that ecosystem crisis we talked about in Section 2. The core idea is to finally recognize the economic value of a standing forest and provide predictable, long-term finance to the 70-plus tropical forest countries.
The idea is to make keeping a forest standing more profitable than cutting it down.
Precisely.
And it required this really innovative financial structure to work, a blended finance model. Can you break that down for us?
So the TFFF is aiming for a massive $125 billion total size. It has two layers. The first layer is a $25 billion guarantee layer from governments and philanthropies. This acts as a financial buffer, a cushion.
A first loss buffer.
Exactly. The bulk of the money, $100 billion, would then be raised by selling highly rated bonds to big institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies.
And they're highly rated precisely because of that $25 billion buffer, which de-risks the investment for them.
That's the key. That's how blended finance works. You use a little bit of public money to unlock a huge amount of private capital.
And the payments to the forest countries are based on performance.
Yes, very innovative. Payments are assessed using satellite data to track forest cover. You literally get paid for keeping your forest standing. And crucially, at least 20% of those payments are mandated to go directly to indigenous peoples and local communities, recognizing their role as forest stewards.
So we have this huge, innovative, de-risked financial vehicle. What was the reality when they tried to launch it at COP30?
The launch was a huge disappointment. The TFFF launched, having secured only $6.6 billion in initial funding.
$6.6 billion out of a target of 125.
A tiny fraction. It was a massive shortfall.
Why? What went wrong? Was it political hesitation?
Overwhelmingly political hesitation. Key wealthy nations failed to commit. Major economies like the US, the UK, and China all withheld investment. The UK, which had been deeply involved in designing the fund, actually backed out at the last minute.
And there was also opposition from civil society groups.
Correct. Over 200 of them objected fiercely to having the World Bank host the fund. They were worried that the governance structure would be dominated by the wealthy donor countries, limiting the power of the developing countries the fund is meant to serve.
Which brings us to the broader existential problem here, the adaptation finance gap, which is still staggering.
This is probably the most glaring failure of the whole global response. The 2021 target to double adaptation finance to $40 billion a year by 2025. It was comprehensively missed. Developed nations only provided $26 billion in 2023.
So what was the response at COP30 to that failure? Another target.
Another target. They adopted a call to at least triple adaptation finance by 2035. Which sounds ambitious, but developing countries have been begging for a 2030 deadline.
And even tripling it, is that anywhere near enough?
That's the hard truth. It's mathematically almost irrelevant. The actual adaptation finance needs for developing nations are estimated to be around $310 billion a year. Every year.
So $26 billion provided versus a $310 billion need.
It means that somewhere between 87 and 93% of adaptation needs are just not being financed. It is an enormous, life-threatening gap.
Were there any new mechanisms launched at COP30 to try and at least make projects more attractive to investors to bridge that gap?
Yes, there was a recognition that you need to move from just writing plans to having shovel-ready projects. So two key initiatives were launched. The first is called the FINE Initiative. That's Fostering Investable National Implementation.
What's its goal?
It aims to unlock $1 trillion in adaptation project pipelines within 3 years, with a key goal of getting 20% of that from the private sector. It's about helping countries structure projects, like climate-resilient infrastructure, in a way that private investors can actually back.
So it's about creating bankable projects.
It is. And the second was the Belém Health Action Plan. This was backed by $300 million from a funders coalition, and it aims to strengthen climate-resilient health systems and disease prevention, directly addressing that zoonotic risk we talked about earlier.
So while all these policy fights over NDCs and governance are dragging on, the markets are moving.
They really are, and this provides a necessary dynamic counterpoint to all the political inertia. The focus is shifting from just regulating carbon to actively investing in the solutions.
And the numbers are huge.
They are. Revenues from green products and services have more than doubled in the last decade. They surpassed $5.1 trillion in 2024. That is an economy that is now larger than the GDP of most countries on Earth.
What really surprised analysts was the speed of the growth compared to other sectors.
It was the outperformance. The market capitalization of the green economy grew at a compound annual growth rate, a key SHIAR of 15% between 2014 and 2024.
15%.
The only sector that grew faster was technology, at 18%. So this just proves that the transition is not just some environmental cost. It is now a highly attractive economic growth engine that investors are rushing to get a piece of.
Where is that capital concentrated? Is it still mostly in developed markets?
Geographically, yes. Developed markets still account for about 84% of the green economy's market cap. But, and this is really important, but if you look at what's called green exposure or penetration, emerging markets are actually showing significant progress.
What does that mean, green exposure?
Right. It means that within emerging economies, a higher percentage of their total economic activity is now coming from green sectors. Think massive solar and wind deployments, electric 2- and 3-wheelers, sustainable ag tech. So while the total pool of capital is smaller, the rate of green integration is actually faster.
That's that leapfrogging potential we always hear about.
Exactly.
So let's zoom in on Europe, where the goals are really explicit and the funding challenges are just immense.
Europe is where you have the highest ambition meeting the toughest regulatory framework. To hit their targets, a 55% cut in emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050, the investment needed is staggering. We're talking about 1.2 trillion euros every single year.
1.2 trillion.
That's about 8.3% of the EU's 2023 GDP that needs to be poured into greening the economy year in, year out.
And the critical number for policymakers is the gap, right? The difference between what they were spending and what they need to spend now.
Precisely. The reports show they need an extra 477 billion euros a year on top of what they were already investing just to hit that 2030 target. The scale of capital that needs to be mobilized is just immense.
Which sectors are the most capital hungry?
In absolute terms, it's transport. That needs about 754 billion euros a year, and about 80% of that is just for road transport, building EVs, charging infrastructure, battery factories.
But where is the biggest increase in investment needed?
That would be in clean energy supply. Investment there needs to increase by a factor of 1.7 annually compared to what they were doing before. They have to build bigger, faster, and more interconnected renewable grids than ever before.
So what are the main roadblocks to financing all of this? How are the banks responding?
We're seeing a really significant shift in how banks are pricing risk. They are now actively integrating both transition risk and physical climate risk into their lending.
So what does that look like in practice?
It means they're giving discounts, better loan terms, to low-carbon firms. But, and this is critical, they're charging a climate risk premium, so higher interest rates, to high-emitting firms that don't have a credible green transition plan.
So if you're a cement company without a decarbonization plan, your cost of borrowing money just went up.
It absolutely did. The market is financializing transition risk. And they're doing the same for physical risk, looking at where a company's assets are located relative to flood zones or wildfire risk when deciding on credit.
But there are still structural barriers, right? Especially on the public funding side.
Yes. Big ones. There are skill shortages, complex regulations that vary across the EU, and this looming issue of a green public funding gap that's expected to hit around 2027 when the big post-COVID recovery and resilience facility expires.
Now, if mitigation is all about cutting emissions, adaptation is about surviving the changes that are already locked in. How are companies investing in adaptation?
It's becoming mandatory, not optional. Investors are demanding it. But we need to be clear on the terms. Adaptation measures are things a company does to protect its own assets, like building a flood wall around a factory.
Okay.
Adaptation solutions are the products and services a company makes to help others be more resilient. So, manufacturing and selling those flood walls.
And what are companies prioritizing when it comes to measures?
Overwhelmingly, it's flood controls and disaster preparedness. They're citing really favorable cost-benefit ratios. It's not just about avoiding future losses. It's about near-term efficiency and, getting lower insurance premiums right now. They're realizing that good adaptation is just good risk management.
But the policy around adaptation still seems to be lagging behind mitigation.
It is. Adaptation taxonomies, the rule books that define what counts as a green adaptation investment, are still much less mature than they are for mitigation. It just emphasizes the urgent need for standardized physical climate risk assessments across all sectors to guide this investment properly.
Okay, let's wrap this section up by looking at a crucial mitigation strategy that's moving really fast. Carbon dioxide removal, or CDR.
2025 was a huge year for CDR. It really marked a shift from, early stage speculative ideas to more confident, larger scale deployments.
Both in nature-based solutions and engineered ones.
Both. We're seeing major corporate agreements for nature-based credits, things like afforestation, soil carbon projects, peatland restoration.
Who are the big buyers driving that demand?
It's being driven by the tech giants with big net zero pledges. Microsoft, Google, Meta, Netflix, they're making these massive long-term purchasing agreements, which is injecting the kind of patient capital these projects desperately need to scale up.
And where's the policy momentum coming from?
Interestingly, while U.S. federal support has seen some political pushback and delays, other countries are really stepping up. The U.K. announced plans to fully integrate CDR, both nature-based and engineered, into its emissions trading scheme by 2029.
And what does putting CDR into an ETS signal to the market?
It's a massive signal. It essentially says that carbon removal is going to be treated as an industrial activity on par with emissions reduction. It institutionalizes the demand and provides the regulatory certainty you need to attract the trillions in private investment required to scale this stuff to a climate-relevant level. It confirms the equation is now cutting emissions and actively removing carbon. #tag outro.
So let's try and synthesize what we've learned about this defining year. We've looked across the crisis, the policy, and the finance landscapes of 2025.
And the year was defined by this stark, really unsettling tension. On one side, you had the physical crisis just accelerating violently.
The $107 billion insured loss, the $40 billion LA wildfire.
The unprecedented speed of that 26-foot flash flood, the lowest Arctic sea ice on record, and that deeply political admission of a likely 1.5 C overshoot at COP30. The data confirms the crisis is immediate, is financially catastrophic, and it's hitting everyone, high and low-income nations alike.
And then on the other side, you have the global response, which is complex and slow, but it is attempting these huge structural shifts, the new target to triple adaptation finance, for instance.
Even though that current adaptation gap, the $310 billion a year we need versus the $26 billion we're getting, remains just vast and life-threatening.
And we saw these finance mechanisms evolving so rapidly, from the way banks lend money in Europe to these ambitious blended finance vehicles like the TFFF, which was aiming for that $125 billion scale.
The core lesson for you, the listener, is really clear. The financial and physical risks are moving dramatically faster than the political consensus we need to actually fund the solution. The tools are there, the $5.1 trillion green economy, mandatory corporate adaptation, but the scale of public and blended finance, especially for critical things like adaptation and nature conservation, still vastly outstrips the supply.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought that connects the health crisis directly to that finance gap we just discussed. Our sources show us that destroying tropical forests is intrinsically linked to the rise of infectious diseases like Nipah and Ebola.
Caused by displaced wildlife coming into contact with people.
Exactly. So given that the Tropical Forests Forever facility, the TFFF, which was designed specifically to fund the protection of these vital ecosystems, secured only $6.6 billion against its $125 billion target. What is the true compounding cost of failing to finance forest conservation? Not just in terms of carbon, but in terms of future global health security and pandemic prevention.
We are failing to fund the protection of the very natural systems that protect us from the next great global catastrophe. That is the profound, challenging liability we leave you to consider today.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.